Mattias Desmet. Thank you for making time to be on We're Sauce with us. And I would like to welcome you to this new episode. Could you kindly introduce yourself for our audience here?
Thank you, Florence. Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. I'm Mattias Desmet, as you said. I'm a professor in clinical psychology at Ghent University. I also have a master degree in statistics, and in the beginning of the crisis, I started to study the statistics a little bit, and I immediately had the strong impression that the dangerousness of the virus was dramatically overrated, and that's why I started to publish some opinion papers immediately, warning that the fear of the virus could be more dangerous than the virus itself. Maybe that's sufficient as a short introduction, or isn't it?
Yes, yeah. I think that just paints the picture. And if for those folks who have not been alive or awake for the past 3 years, of course, we're talking not just about COVID, but the COVID response, the government response to this. And I believe you're in Belgium, is that correct?
Yes, I'm in Belgium.
Okay, so the audience is obviously located all over I'm currently in the UK, but I'm based in Singapore most of the time. And just between these three countries, we can see the difference of government response to what we assume to be the exact same event. So I would like to talk a little bit more, in fact, a lot more about your very successful book, which is called The Psychology of Totalitarianism, which is not very easy to pronounce in English for a francophone for a francophone person. And of course, we won't dive into the Hannah Arendt precedent because, again, I will assume the audience either knows about Hannah Arendt or will read about it. But what's super interesting in this book, and I encourage a lot of people to read it, not just because they might or might not be interested in COVID, or they might or might not be interested in dictatorship or totalitarianism in general, but rather because of a mechanistic approach to how to understand something that is going to happen. And at this scale that it's happened, I think it's pretty useful because it's happened to a huge amount of people. So if I can start, in the part of your book, I started your book and I was taken aback by the fact that something that has been forgotten, I think, by a lot of ourselves in the science community, but I think even more so by the general public, is even before COVID, we seem to have had a problem with, quote, the science, because the science has been the thing that we've been very focused on during COVID. Follow the science. Anthony Fauci phenomenally said, I am the science. If you criticize me, you criticize the science. So can we go back to before COVID? And I want to have your opinion, because you wrote about it very nicely in your introduction. Did we have a problem with what we mean by the science? Or was it a consensus that science has no methodological problem, everything's fine, we can take something, we can reproduce it, nothing to see here?
Well, for everyone who wanted to see it, it was clear that science struggled with dramatic problems. I started my PhD in 2003 at Ghent University, and I studied the so-called replication crisis in psychology. Actually, I first started my PhD in 2003, and my plan was to do just a classical research in psychology. But then, to me, it became clear that most of the research methods used actually suffered from severe methodological problems. And at that moment, I asked my promoter if I could switch the topic of my PhD, the focus of my PhD, and instead of doing a classical research in psychology, if I was allowed to study the research methods themselves. And it was like a happy coincidence because 2 years later, it turned out in 2005, the replication crisis started, and it turned out that most methods used in the sciences lead to invalid and unreliable results to the extent that in an academic domain such as the medical sciences, up to 85% of the papers published is not reproducible. That means that if a certain research group publishes a paper and the second research group reanalyzes the same data, the second research group finds completely different conclusions. So that's what it means if a study is not reproducible. And So I at that moment, yeah, it became clear for the academic world that there were dramatic problems with the validity and the quality of academic research. And the academic world tried to solve it a little bit, but in my opinion, they didn't tackle the root cause of the problem. And that's what I described in a little book, The Psychology of the Pursuit of Objectivity in Psychology, that there is a problem with the basic assumptions of our contemporary current research paradigm. For instance, we try to measure many things that actually cannot be measured. And no matter, even if there is no fraud anymore, even if no errors are made anymore in research, even if the methods are applied in a right and an accurate way, even then, still, if we continue to rely on invalid measurements, if we continue to try to measure things that are fundamentally unmeasurable, we will never end up at valid, reproducible conclusions. So that's about what I wrote in my little book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, The Pursuit of Objectivity in Psychology. And it became clear to me that at first I thought that these problems only manifested in the social sciences and in psychology in particular, but it's not true at all. In the medical sciences, it's even worse. And so it's a very good question. For what reason did we end up in this dramatic state in the academic world? And that's something that I described in my book. The problem is, for instance, that when modern sciences emerged somewhere, let's say in the beginning of the 17th century, or in the beginning of the 16th century, it depends a little bit. Science was a discourse through which a minority went against a dominant discourse. These guys, these early scientists, had the intuition that we needed a new way to position in reality, that we needed an open-minded way to listen to what the phenomena of nature had to tell. That we needed a new method to come to knowledge, and that was a scientific method. And they, in one way or another, they went against the dominant discourse, which at that time was a dogmatic, institutionalized, religious discourse. And in the beginning, these scientists discovered new things, and their work was very fruitful, or at least it allowed humanity for the first time to change its existential conditions. Whether there was a good thing or not, that's a different question. But it definitely allowed humanity, the human being, to have an impact, to control its natural environment in a way as it never was capable before. And that led to huge successes. It made science very successful. And once a discourse becomes successful, once a discourse becomes the dominant discourse itself, it usually loses its characteristics and its qualities of truth speech. It stops being truth speech. And while writing my book, I suddenly understood why that happens time and time again. I think that as a discourse becomes a discourse that has a grip on the majority of the people, as a discourse becomes dominant, it's used for all kinds of ends that it was not used before. It's used to manipulate the population. It's used to make a career. It's used to be successful. It's used to earn money, and so on. My soap is the best one. That's proven in scientific research. And in that way, the scientific discourse got perverted. It lost its qualities of truth speech, and in a certain way, it became a dogma itself. It stopped being based on open-mindedness. It became a dogma, it became a prejudice, just like the institutionalized religious discourse had been at the moment when science emerged. And that's what we are dealing with now. At universities, I'm not sure that the people who are doing research most of the time try to find truth. I think in many cases, they try to publish papers to be successful, to make a career, to become a professor, and so on.
I think what's very interesting in what you said is that it seems to be a process, a journey that we started some decades back, in which we captured a phenomenon which is inquiry into science, inquiry into various subjects, and how to mechanize these inquiries so that loads of people can do it, so that we have lots and lots of results. And along the way, certainly from my experience and reading your book, it seems to be that you had more than experience. You had the evidence that at least in some fields, there was a real crisis of capacity to say, well, actually that result is trustworthy and expandable because we can reproduce regardless the team or the labs or the circumstance. So I think, again, the general public was probably not aware of that as much because it wasn't publicized that much outside the research of the scientific community. So comes 2019, what I would like to think is, what do you think predisposed you particularly to see something that lots of people around us could not see, still can't see now, even though now we have so much more data than we did back then? Do you think that having had this view already on the other side of that door, which meant that door had lots and lots of problem behind it, it wasn't as perfect as lots of people thought? Do you think that that is one of the reason why you could see something was amiss?
I don't know. I don't know. You know, maybe it's rather the other way around. The same reason why I saw that there was something wrong at university back in 2003 enabled me, or the same factor, the same enabled me at the beginning of the corona crisis to see immediately that there was something wrong again. And I noticed that several of the central scholars who revealed the problems with research during the replication crisis also revealed the problems during the corona crisis. For instance, John Ioannidis is definitely the most famous one.
Yeah.
He was involved in the replication crisis as well. And I don't know, 2 or 3 months before the corona crisis started, I intuitively felt that something was about to happen in our society. I noticed how all the negative parameters increased exponentially, how more and more people suffered from burnout, how many people suffered from depression, anxiety, and so on. And I sensed somewhere that something was about to happen. And 2 months before the corona crisis started, at New Year's Eve 2019, I was on a short holiday with a few friends, and one evening I was talking with them, and I said, "You will see, one of these days we will wake up in a new society. Everything will change." Because I had a feeling that the complex and dynamical system that society always is was nearing a tipping point, and that it would try to find a new equilibrium, that the system would change. And I believe that a few months later, when one morning we wake up and the country was in lockdown, I immediately had the feeling that is what I had been feeling before. And 2 months before the corona crisis, I went to the bank, paid back my mortgage, just because I wanted to be as free as possible, and I didn't want to be dependent on banks or no matter what. And the corona crisis started, and you immediately had a feeling there is something seriously wrong here. We think we are in a health crisis. We think we are dealing with a virus, and that might be true to a certain extent, but there is a much more serious problem. We are on the verge of a radical collapse of democracy. We are on the verge of democracy being replaced by technocracy. And I immediately published some opinion papers in that week. I immediately knew that I would speak out, and I would continue to speak out. Why that was the case? Why I chose to speak out? I don't know. It was as if I didn't have another choice. I had a feeling like, look, if I don't speak out now, I don't have to speak out never anymore. And I just decided to speak out, and I knew immediately that I would continue to speak out. I have always had a certain inclination to speak out. I throughout my life, I always have been something, I think, who didn't care about what the group thought, or not too much, and who tried to articulate what I really believed in myself. And in my family, from my father's side, that was also the case. There were many of my several of my grandfathers were more or less famous to speak out, even when that meant that they were excommunicated by the church or something. They didn't care and they spoke out. So it's maybe something that runs in the family to a certain extent, but for the rest, I can't say why I speak out or why I noticed that there was something wrong. I don't know.
And when you say speak out, so there is a few passages in your book, again in the introduction, where you talk about this massive crisis that we were in. Much of the population is trapped in almost complete social isolation. We have a remarkable increase in absenteeism due to mental suffering, an unprecedented proliferation in the use of psychotropic drugs, a burnout epidemic that paralyzes the entire companies, governments, and institutions. So that, for me, was that almost the setup. Being in the burnout intervention for the past 20 years in healthcare staff, we knew very well that was a massive problem that has been there for 10 years, and it was only going to get worse, and that was without a pandemic. So there was seemingly a setup in the population, both in the professional population and the general public, of a sort of disaggregation of one era and moving on into another era, brought in by technology, by social norms, etc. Can you talk a little bit about whether you thought that technology was going to play a role in the methodology of how to deal with this pandemic, or whether you thought this was going to be just data-driven, oriented with science and evidence-based, or did you think that it wasn't going to go well, even after the first sort of sensation that something was afoot? Did you have a sort of sense of it could get that bad as we've seen it has become?
Yes. And I think we've seen only the beginning of the process at the moment. I immediately knew that essentially what happened was not that we just were trying to find the best evidence-based strategy to deal with the virus. Not at all. It is just every time throughout the last decades, a new object of anxiety appears, whether it is terrorism or climate change or viruses or no matter what. Every time we go in a direction of a more technologically controlled society, we go in a direction of a surveillance state, and so on. So we just cannot handle risks anymore. Or the population has a very hard time accepting that there is such a thing as a risk in life, that life is never without risks, and that we have to learn to live with it. And this incapability to accept that there are certain risks in life makes that people believe institutions that promise them that they will eliminate all risks and that they will create a society which is so perfectly controlled that there is no risk anymore, that there is even no dead and dying anymore. If you want to, I'm sure that I believe that the ideology that is playing in the background here is definitely the transhumanist ideology, an ideology which believes that through rational understanding of reality, we will be able to understand, control, and manipulate life to such an extent that the human being will not die anymore, that there will be no suffering anymore, and so on. That's what transhumanism believes, and it's just the contemporary variant of what I call the mechanist, rationalist view on the world, the materialist view on man and the world. So that's what's happening here. The threats involved are probably not really new, or at least they are not much worse than the threats that existed before. But our way of reacting to them is different. We fall prey to the delusional belief that we will be able to control everything, and we believe institutions who promise us that they will create like a new kind of paradise for the human being on the basis of rational, mechanistic understanding of the human being and of reality and nature in general.
So I wanted to ask you, what were your thoughts when you saw the way that the Western democracy, and by this I'm going to be very generalistic with the term, I'm just going to include basically most of the Western country, European country, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, how they were responding in the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020 compared to what we were seeing early age in China. And for us, certainly, Singapore being very proximal to China, we follow that model pretty fast compared to Europe and America, which was delayed by a few months. Were you surprised that a model of dealing with that pandemic, both in terms of the scientific approach and the human management approach, which means to segregate people, to put them in there, to put them in camp if they were ill, or to put them in isolation. Did you think that this was going to take hold as much as it did in Western country? Were you surprised by this?
I was surprised. You know, retrospectively speaking, I was not surprised. But when it happened, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I just said, is this possible here in Europe? And so I was surprised, but indeed, it's when I look back now, maybe it was only logical. It's an illusion to believe that in the Western world, people do not fall prey to this delusional idea that technological control is the only solution for the climate crisis, for terrorism, for viruses, and so on. That's what people believe in, and it's this ideology that always believes that rational understanding and control and manipulation is the only way to change the human condition. It's this ideology that is playing in the background. I'm sure of that. It's just all these narratives, the climate narrative, the corona narrative, and so on, are actually, in the end, many people just believe in them, or at least they behave as if they really believe in them. But I think that the major institutions in the first place use these narratives as a kind of propaganda to convince the people, to entice the people to go along with their ideological reshaping of society they want to carry through. So that's my view on what happens now.
And so another question that I was struck by reading another book, which I don't know whether you've read or not, on the opiate pandemic or epidemic in the U.S. for the past 20 years. It's called Empire of Pain, which is about the Purdue and Sackler family. So here is another pandemic that has been killing loads and loads of people over a period of decades, and has not mustered anything like the response that COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 has managed to gathered in such little period of time. And yet the numbers, if you've just basically being metric based, if you look at the amount of people who've died, the amount of people who've become addicted to opiates, and this is prescription drugs, it's not street drugs, and then the lead on to other drugs like fentanyl, this entire crisis, similar to a crisis of obesity, for example, is a crisis, is a pandemic to some extent, and it is not much at all raised anything like a centralized decision and then a centralized execution, both at the level of country, but even more stunningly at the level of cross countries, in synchrony. So my question is, why do you think that is? Because that is so stunning.
Oh yeah, well, yes, it is. Of course, it's addicted people can be controlled very well, definitely by those who deliver the drugs, and government is more and more the institution who delivers the drugs, I'm afraid. So indeed, it's just not the virus or the disease is essential in this crisis. It's just the control itself. Everything that can be used to exercise more control over the population will be used. And indeed, for instance, if you compare it to the number of children dying from starvation in developing countries, it would be so easy to save these lives. without risk at all. Just pay some money to feed them, and the problem is solved. It's maybe a little bit more difficult than that, but still, it is much easier. And if you see what we are expected to do for people infected with the virus with, after all, a very low fatality rate, then it's just absurd if you compare the two. That we don't care about the children dying from hunger, and at the same time are willing to destroy our entire social fabric for a virus that of which in the end the average victim is about 83 years old. So it's so absurd that that is just baffling that so many people buy into this narrative.
And in terms of, before we start, we talk about mass formation, because I think that has become now a trigger word. Certainly, for the first time that I heard it, I knew about the term from various reading in psychology, but I think that the time that Robert Malone spoke about it on Joe Rogan, I think that just unleashed a whole cascade of people and sort of responding to that word sequence, mass formation, and the image that it could unleash with it. So I want to just cite a part of a sentence that you write in your book. You say, dictatorships are based on a primitive psychological mechanism, namely on the creation of a climate of fear amongst the population based on the brutal potential of the dictatorship regime. Totalitarianism, on the other hand, has its roots in the insidious psychological process of mass formation. So could you talk to us about how did you come to basically come from an impression of what's going on to actually understanding and trying to articulate that understanding to other folks so that they would have a tool, a context under which trying to analyze and comprehend what was being unrolled?
Yes, well, let us go back to the beginning of my academic career, when I published this little book about methodological problems in psychological research. And in this little book, I explained in a very concrete and tangible way why most research methods and why most measurement methods in psychology just can't lead to valid conclusions. And I showed it in such a simple way, such a visible way, such a tangible way. And still, I noticed that over 90% of my colleagues just didn't want to see what I was trying to show them. They continued to use the same research methods, and they even became angry at me. And it was at that moment that I became really interested in a psychological question as to what can explain why people become so radically blind under certain conditions and continue to believe in the most absurd beliefs. And in the corona crisis, I went through exactly the same process. I tried to show people why it was clear that the statistics were absurd and nobody wanted to see it. And I noticed around me how many people continue to believe in the most absurd statements that were presented in mainstream media. And I very soon made the switch. And at the end of May 2020, for me at that moment, it was beyond doubt, proven beyond doubt, that the initial mathematical models had been completely wrong, and that the virus, the dangerousness of the virus was dramatically overrated. And at that moment, I decided to focus on the psychological level. Why, for God's sake, how is it possible that so many people continue to believe in this narrative? And I very soon had the intuition that what we were dealing with was a large-scale process of mass formation, and that's why I started to focus on that level. I believe that it made more sense to just try to understand and explain what exactly was going on in society at a psychological level.
So would you say that mass formation is a ground-up phenomena, or is it an engineered phenomena entirely, or is it a mixture of both?
It depends. It can be an emerging phenomenon, something that appears bottom up from the population, and it can be a phenomenon that is created top down through indoctrination and propaganda. And it can be something in between. So, like for instance, in Nazi Germany, there's mass formation, as you just quoted from my book, is the basis of totalitarian states, totalitarian systems. And the two most famous totalitarian systems up until now were Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And both were based on mass formation, but in the Soviet Union, the mass formation was artificially created, top down. First, there was an elite who used indoctrination and propaganda and who created the mass formation. So that's a possibility. And in Nazi Germany, it went the other way around. The mass formation emerged spontaneously in the population, and then slowly, from the masses, an elite was formed, which took the lead, and which, together with the masses, seized control of society. And in the Soviet Union, the same happened, but the other way around. First, there was the elite. That elite created the mass formation, and that elite used the masses to seize control of society. In both cases, the end result is about the same. The end result is what Hannah Arendt called a diabolic pact between the elite and the masses. So, it can happen in two ways. What are we dealing with here now? Well, it's clear, I believe, that this entire narrative on the coronavirus and the set of measures, that there were plans already to impose such measures when confronted with one or another viral outbreak. So, I believe in this case, the entire plan to react with lockdowns, mask wearing, and so on existed before the corona crisis, and it was imposed to society through an impressive program of propaganda. I never said differently. Now I hear that there are people who reproach me that I would say that all this happens spontaneously. That's simply not true. It's simply not true. I never said something like that. I never made large statements about it because I don't think it's my level of expertise. I don't think I am an expert at in the way in which institutions used propaganda and indoctrination. I'm writing a new book about that, about propaganda and indoctrination. But at the moment I wrote this book, I wanted to focus on the dynamic itself, on the mass formation itself, and the effects such a mass formation has at the level of individual functioning. And that's what people recognized so much. They noticed indeed how their fellow human beings, their neighbors, their family members suddenly started to believe in completely absurd ideas, that they suddenly became enthusiastic about something that would lead to their own destruction, that they suddenly started to become radically intolerant for dissonant voices, and so on. And that can only be explained by this phenomenon of mass formation. And how this mass formation emerges, that's another question. And to what extent it was an emerging phenomenon, a spontaneously emergent phenomenon, or an artificially provoked phenomenon, that's a different question. But I could, without any problem, quote several paragraphs in my book where I say that at the level of the causation of the phenomenon, we definitely cannot exclude that it is the effect of large propaganda campaigns, even of conspiracies. I don't believe we should overestimate. We should never explain too much in terms of conspiracies, because that always creates the idea that there is only one guilty group, a small elite, a small evil elite, which manipulates everyone and which declares. And in a conspiracy theory, very soon there is only one person who is guilty and the rest is not guilty. The rest is innocent. That's never true. We are all in this together. The elite is created by the population. The elite would not be the elite, would not be so successful if it didn't appeal to certain tendencies in the population. And if we believe that the only one responsible for these problems is a small evil elite, then we will automatically be inclined to conclude that the solution to the problem is the destruction of this elite. But if you believe that the problem would be solved then you are very naive. It wouldn't be solved. If we would destroy this elite, the population would create exactly the same elite, as long as it continues to start from the mechanistic, rationalist view on man and the world. So what needs to change is this view on man and the world. That's the root cause. That's what I try to explain in my book. It's this rationalist, mechanist, materialist view on man and the world that created both a population that is very sensitive for mass formation and thus for totalitarianism, and at the same time that created a new elite which believes that it should control the population through indoctrination propaganda, through manipulation based on rational understanding of the psychological mechanisms involved in a society. So the root cause of the problem is the ideology. And both the population and the elite are responsible. We all, and me as well, every one of us to a certain extent, falls prey to this rationalist thinking. So we should start solving the problem that is inside ourselves. And that doesn't mean that we should be blind about this elite, this manipulating elite. Not at all. We should see it as clearly as possible. We should try to inform ourselves as clearly as possible. But we shouldn't be so naive that we believe that the destruction of this elite would be sufficient to solve the problem. To the contrary, violence is a gift for the elite. There is nothing they feel more comfortable with than with a violent freedom movement. Violence can be perfectly controlled. Perfectly. It can be, it's not a problem at all. When we use violence, there very soon will be support in the population to act aggressively upon us. To the contrary, if we remain calm, if we stick to ethical principles, if we use the principles of non-violent resistance, we will overcome all problems. We will survive as a group. We might lose a lot, might be difficult, everything can happen. But as a group we will survive, and the masses will exhaust themselves. The masses will slowly exhaust themselves, they will become weaker and weaker, and the people who choose to stick to their ethical principles, to remain loyal to their ethical principles, will become stronger and stronger, and in the end they will become strong enough and have the authority to impose a new and different principles for a new human living together, a really humane living together. That's what we should do. Violence will be only self-destructive. And if you analyze the situation only in terms of an evil elite, then it's only logical that many people conclude that we need a violent revolution to destroy this elite. And that's exactly what we shouldn't do.
So in your analysis of mass formation, you cited two big government formation, the Russian and we talked about the Nazi Germany, and we know how far that went, but they didn't have technology and they didn't have the grounds that you describe of the state of the population in 2019 in most Western countries, where they seem to have had the prerequisite status already to be particularly frail to mass formation. So would you think that the scale of this mass formation that we went through with COVID is exceptionally different than the two preceding ones? So that's question number one. Question number two is, by the token that you've said, given how mechanistic our sense of culture is now, and technology has enhanced that, and we are to some extent very atomized and therefore very prone for future mass formation, isn't it the case that we're now going to enter a cycle of successive, perhaps smaller scale mass formation for other topics you've mentioned? Climate change, there is a war raging in Europe, there's possibly another war waiting to rage in the Asia-Pacific region between China and Taiwan. Do you think that we're now entered with COVID a almost perpetual cycle of people being prone to then move on to the next one in terms of mass formation? So these are the two questions.
Let me first try to answer the first one. Yes, indeed, the conditions for mass formation are more optimal now than they were in the beginning of the 20th century. The mass formation exists as long as mankind exists. There we have seen the Crusades, the witch hunts, the French Revolution, and so on. But what is clear is that the phenomenon becomes increasingly strong throughout the last few hundred centuries. And that's simply because the number of isolated, disconnected people increased throughout the last few hundred centuries as a consequence of the mechanization and the industrialization of the world. It's the mechanization of the world, the industrialization of the world, the use of technology that disconnects people from their natural and social environments and that makes them more and more vulnerable for mass formation, which led in the last few centuries to ever larger phenomena of mass formation. In the beginning of the 20th century, we've seen the very large mass formations in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany, and now we see even larger ones. The mass formation in the corona crisis actually is a worldwide mass formation. That's the first time in history, I think, that there is a worldwide mass formation. So, does that make that we have to feel hopeless? No, not at all. Not at all. If we make the right choices, if we just, the way in which I explain mass formation, the mechanism of mass formation, makes clear that what you need to do in the first place, if you don't go along with the masses, if you don't belong to the masses, is to continue to speak out. That's perfectly clear. We have to continue to speak out. And in this way, we will prevent the mass formation to go to the ultimate stage where the masses start to destroy, to commit atrocities towards the people who do not go along with them. That's what we need to do. We need to continue to speak out. And the technological control, there is a huge technological control machinery that didn't exist, or not to this extent, in Nazi Germany or in the Soviet Union. But at the same time, the time spirit, the zeitgeist changed. There is less support for overt aggression towards the people who do not go along with the masses. So there is no need to be desperate. We just have to focus, to keep in mind that essentially we should not try to predict too much what will happen, but we should know that what will really matter in the end is whether or not we stick to our ethical principles. That's the solution to the problem. We have to live up and to stick to ethical principles. In a dehumanizing world, we have to represent the group of people who stays loyal to ethical principles, who realizes the importance of ethical principles. If you read the works of people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and maybe also Primo Levi or Viktor Frankl, they all said the same. In this pool of darkness of the concentration camps, almost everyone started to behave in a beast-like manner. But there was a small minority who went in the opposite direction, who more and more started to become aware of the importance of ethical principles for a human being, and who more and more chose to stay loyal to these principles, to live up to these principles. And these people went through a very fast process of evolution, of mental evolution, of psychological evolution, of emotional evolution, of spiritual evolution even. And they became stronger and stronger very often, both at the psychological and at the physical level. So it's this wonderful process that we should go through now. No need to be desperate. It will not be easy in the years to come, that's for sure. But it all has meaning. You can compare it to a process in which a large organism gives birth to a smaller one. There is the large group who puts a lot of pressure on a small group, who pushes it through a tunnel where it would never go through without the pressure, and in this way, who makes this group go through a process of evolution as a human being, which it would not go through if it were not of the pressure exercised by the large group.
So let me be the devil's advocate. So here we are in August of 2022. This is now nearly 3 years into this. And in a lot of the countries, including Europe, but at the supranational level, there is a push for digitalization even more than there was 3 years back. So, for example, in Singapore, we now have, through the pandemic, we've had a track and trace app. That track and trace app has lots of data, including your location, your friends, your connection. And those are the evident declarative one. Now, there's a talk at the EU level of a digital identity passport that would contain not just demographic data, but perhaps health data, and so on. So there is, and I've heard Albert Bola, explain some of the technology that we know is of existence, is not yet ready for market, but it will come out, which is a tracking device that you can swallow that can tell whether you've actually adhered to your treatment, your medical treatment. It could even say that how much dose did you get? Did you get 5 milligram less than you should? And he said that with great joy, that this was an amazing evolution. And so I think the signs in terms of follow the money, follow the technology, and follow the political power, because in this case, science, if we call this science, is power. And power asks science what to do, and then science executes to some extent because science makes money out of it as well. So are there not signs there that, in fact, the foot in the door that's happened with COVID, and a lot of people, slow boiling themselves into accepting more and more and more now, but they're going to be so relieved that they don't have to wear a mask and they don't have to maybe take a 17th dose of something. But the exchange to that is going to be something that is even more of a technology gel, and that has been put nicely into a piece of cake that feels sweet and very nice to have right now, because we've been beaten and battered. And I very much worry that the elegance with which they're bringing this up seems to be woefully unnoticed by a lot of people, that basically we are exchanging a small BB gun for a nuclear power plant. And it seems to be all like, oh, but it's going to be so much more convenient, because should we have another pandemic, all of that is going to be there. So what's your view on that?
Oh, yes, definitely. Many people will swallow it and many people will buy into it. But there will be a substantial group who doesn't buy into it and who refuses to conform. And that's what we have to do. We have to refuse to conform in a consistent way, unwavering, refusing to conform. And I believe, it's my firm belief that they will accept it. They won't impose it, but they will try to make life a hell for those who refuse to conform. And we have to go through that. We might lose a lot, really a lot. But there are too much people who are very determined. Never, ever will I conform to that ideology. And that's what we have to do. We have to stay strong together, to defy the masses, to defy the system, and to say, no matter what I lose, I will make sure that I don't lose the only thing that is really important to me. And it is the essence of humanity. It is my loyalty to ethical principles, and it is my freedom to refuse to go along with a system that I believe is the most dehumanizing system that ever existed. So that's the way we have to go.
And so in your case, are you prepared to lose your job? Are you prepared? Because in France, it's already happened. Lots of healthcare workers have lost their job because they refuse to be vaccinated. They've not just been fired. They're not fired because if they were fired, they could find another job and they could move on with their life. They're just suspended. And literally that term semantically means so much. It's just suspended from life because you're not allowed to have an income anymore. You're not allowed to change and become a baker. You just can't do anything. You're just stuck. So when you say we have to be prepared to lose a lot, what do you think, for someone like you, for example, an academic, give us an example of what you're prepared to lose?
You can lose so many things. You can lose your job, indeed. You can lose your house. You can lose your life in the end. That's possible, but the better you understand what's happening, the more you understand, I believe, that you have actually no option. If you join the system, which I would never be able to do, I don't know why, but I can't. And but if you do, you might also lose a lot. That's the point. Totalitarian systems are always monsters that devour their own children. That's something Hannah Arendt said. In the end, nobody is safe for the system. Stalin killed 60% of his own Communist Party members, for instance. And the system, in the beginning, there is a certain logic. and the destruction campaigns of the system. But after a while, there is no logic at all anymore. Just the one group after the other, for one reason or another, is deported and eliminated. That's that's so typical for totalitarian system. In the end, they become radically irrational, radically unpredictable, and in their destruction and in their destructiveness. So the better you understand what's happening, the more you see that there is only one option: refusing to conform and making sure that you don't lose, as I said, this one and most important thing for a human being: your loyalty, your ethical principles. And that's my opinion, my 2-cent word opinion.
Okay, and so I'm going to ask, before I ask the question that I asked to all my guests, I'm going to ask one final question, which is about antidotes. So we're going through, or we think we're going through, or we're done with a pandemic. But the pandemic has been telling us that there's antidotes and vaccines, and there's a solution that we can inject ourselves with or take to prevent something from making us ill. If this change of time and government is a battle to be had, what would be the things that you think a regular individual can acquire to protect themselves better, or to become more clairvoyant about what's in front of them, and therefore to be able to resist if that's what's needed of them? What do you think is needed? Is it knowledge? Is it community? Is it social bonding? Is it essential skill set they may not have? What do you think they need?
Social bonding is one thing. Knowledge, definitely not. The higher the level of education, the more vulnerable people become for mass formation. And also, I know people who didn't understand anything about what was going on, and who just sensed intuitively that there was something wrong in the situation, and that they didn't want to buy into that narrative. I think the most important thing is that we have to get in touch again with truth speech. We have to do our best to articulate the words that seem sincere and honest, that emerge in us and that seem sincere and honest. And if we do that, if we time and time again refuse to go along with what the group thinks, just because it is the easiest way to go along with what the group thinks and says, and if to the contrary we also try to articulate what we believe is true, then we will become stronger and stronger, and less susceptible to deception, manipulation, propaganda, and indoctrination. That's what I think.
Well, and to conclude this hour that went really fast, at least for me, I would like to ask you the question that I ask all my guests, which is the title of this podcast, which is, what is your weird sauce for life? And weird sauce, I mean your special experience, your special ingredients that you put into your life to make it worthwhile and to be capable of continuing with what you're doing.
That's the art of good speech. That's something that I call the art of good speech. In my entire life, I have been trying to articulate things as well as possible. I went through a psychoanalytic cure, a psychoanalytic therapy for more than 10 years, in which I tried time and time again to express in words what subjective experiences I had, in which I tried to tell to someone else what I felt inside of me. Now again, I try to understand as well as possible what's happening. I try to articulate this as clear as possible, what I believe is happening. I try to articulate my opinion as well as possible. I try to do it in an as sincere and honest way as possible. That's for me the art of good speech, the art of truth speech. Truth speech which has nothing to do with poetics or something else, but which has everything to do with a kind of speech which is brave enough to say what you think and what you really believe, even if nobody agrees with you, and even if everyone is angry with you because you say it. So that's what I believe, for me, is the major ingredient of my life. And the longer I live, the more I realize that that is really my backbone. It's that what gives me this soft strength and this quiet confidence, and my determination to continue with what I'm doing. It's more important than no matter what else, I think.
Mattias, Desmet, thank you very much for your time. I recommend to all to go and check out your book, or your many books, but the latest book that is on Amazon and on many other platforms where they can buy it digitally. Although I suggest they do that fast because they run out very quickly. I had to buy mine in bulk and distribute them to my friends. So thank you again, and may you be right, and may it be as non-violent and as peaceful a fight as you suggest it might be. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me, Florence, and for listening.
If this conversation stopped you in your track, share it with your network. You never know whose life you might change for the better. Thank you for listening. Stay curious about our next guest, and stay curious about life.